Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here in cyberspace at Chevalier's Books Online. We are gathered here tonight to celebrate the publication of Rebecca Sachs's debut novel, City of a Thousand Gates, and she'll be in conversation with our beloved neighbor and author, Sarah Shun-Lien Bynum. So City of a Thousand Gates is a sprawling, kaleidoscopic novel set in Jerusalem and its environs, with a cast of some 32 characters, all navigating the unique complexities of life in the city. So at the center of the book is the murder of a young Jewish girl on an Israeli settlement, and then the retributive fatal beating of a Palestinian teenager at a shopping mall. But the book contains more than just these terrible events. We follow a Palestinian professor navigating the bureaucracy of trying to secure a travel visa to attend an academic conference, a young Jewish American mother raising her newborn with an army reservist, and a German journalist who, while not reporting on the political conflict, spends her days lusting after an Israeli football star. This is just to name a few of the characters Sachs brings to life on the page. The Washington Post calls City of a Thousand Gates a book whose project seems nothing short of dramatizing one of the world's most unyielding conflicts in a way that shows all sides and yields none. Rebecca Sachs holds an MFA from the programs in writing at the University of California, Irvine, and an MA in Jewish Studies from Tel Aviv University. While living in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, she wrote dispatches for the Paris Review Daily, and she now calls Los Angeles home. Funnily enough, it's not the first time Rebecca's been reading at Chevalier's Books. She first read at Chevalier's as part of the UC Irvine MFA reading series back in 2016, in the before times, which was actually her first public reading of the writing that would become City of a Thousand Gates. So naturally, we feel a little responsible for her current success. And she'll be joined by Sarah Shun-Lien Bynum, who is the author of most recently the short story collection Likes, as well as the novels Miss Hempel Chronicles and Madeline is Sleeping. She's one of our dearest friends at the bookstore and the proud parent of a Chevalier's employee. So Rebecca, Sarah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Miles.
Miles, thank you. And I want to mention that Miles too is a graduate of the incredible program that this beautiful book first germinated in, and so it makes me so excited that there is this relationship between Chevalier's Books and UC Irvine. William, another Chevalier's bookseller, another alum, and it just I love the symbiotic relationship between these two very special communities. So Rebecca, I am just beside myself that I get to talk with you about this book that I had the enormous honor of getting to read an early version of when it was first budding, and now to see it in full bloom is just such a meaningful experience. So let's jump in, and I know that you're going to treat us to a taste of the book, and then we'll talk.
Lovely. Yeah, so I'm going to read a little from a chapter that comes near the end called Emily and Rehavia. All you really need to know, I think, is that this is a Jewish American woman who now lives in Israel with her husband. Okay. Emily knows she's better suited to live in Tel Aviv, in one of the gentrified neighborhoods with abundant Pilates studios, pop-up shops for crystals, and weekend-long probiotic workshops. But she and Ido live in Jerusalem, and this feels right because, one, she and Ido have a car, of course, which means they can escape the claustrophobic shutdown that reigns each week for 25 hours from Friday night through Saturday night. And in that way, the city isn't too oppressive. Two, Ido's parents gave them a house, like gave them an actual house, where Emily tends a garden filled with kale and rosemary, breastfeeds her baby in rooms with high ceilings, an Ottoman house, some call it. Others, an Arab house because of who was chased out. 3, Ito's job in Jerusalem at an animation studio in an industrial zone on the outskirts of the city. And even if his webcomic has kicked off in a meaningful way, and even if Emily's own posts have begun generating revenue since she photographed the girl and the soldier, she knows that Ito will continue working at the studio for the simple reason that he likes having somewhere to go every day. But 4 may be the most important reason to stay in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is magic, or a kind of magic. Emily's acupressure masseuse, an Orthodox Jewish woman originally from Florida, described Jerusalem's magic as touching plains, which doesn't quite make sense, but is also perfect. So for example, you'll hear a song and it will make you think of a woman you knew, only briefly, or no, you didn't really know her, not really. She was someone who sold teeny flower bouquets out of a non-kosher cafe on Fridays before Shabbat came in. They were wildflowers, bound together in twine, and affixed to them always was an unbearably short poem in Hebrew that Ito, when Emily brought one home, would help her sound through. Bestav, in autumn, matok, sweet, haya pardesi, was my orchard. Ito told her that the word for orchard, pardes, was associated not just with fruit, but with learning to the point of a divine encounter that drove some to madness. Emily thought pardes sounded like paradise, the English word, and looked online to find it wasn't a coincidence. The word sprang out of the same Persian root, firdaus, which in Arabic came to refer to a layer of heaven. Emily saved that particular poem or verse, and even now it is tied to one of the bunches of dried sage and rosemary she keeps hanging in the windows. How did it survive all those moves, that brown slip of paper? But it's there, though you'd never notice it unless you were looking for it, hanging in the stately bathroom window, the frosted glass overgrown with creeping vines that tremble pale green in the sun. Bestav matok haya pardesi. That was a long time ago now. They were both students. It was winter when they began, Ito and Emily, a rainy winter. Nearly every weekend, Emily, who was at that time in Tel Aviv for a master's and who had no expectation of staying more than a year, took the 40-minute bus ride to Jerusalem because Ito had a one-bedroom apartment, but she lived with a roommate whose small dog was always pooping in their living room, which was also their dining room.
Oh, Rebecca, I love that passage because it captures so many of the qualities in this book that speak to me and that I wanted to talk to you about tonight. So it was like a perfect lead in. And you know, one of the things that I was most struck by when I first met you and when we were having discussions in the workshop was that you would offer these like wonderful etymologies. Like as we were talking about work, you would bring these new ways of looking at a word choice by unpacking for us the often complex history of a word and its roots and its meaning. And then I was so delighted to learn that, you know, you are not sort of the traditional English major who took creative writing classes and then found herself in an MFA program. You said, oh, you said it's so, in such an unassuming way, you said, oh, I studied Semitic philology. And I just loved knowing that this was the background you were coming from. So can you talk to us a little bit about how that curiosity about language and the history of language, how that eventually led you to writing fiction and how it informs your fiction and how it informs the choices you make as a writer?
Oh, I love that. I think that I've always wanted to get closer in kind of in everything, you know, in in love as in reading. I always crave to be closer, and I think that my studies when I was younger were really motivated by wanting to get all the way inside stories. The stories I guess felt maybe the most obsessed with tended to emerge from the ancient world. Even those words, the ancient world, it always felt so exciting for me to hear. And in particular, the what we in the West call the Near East, essentially Mesopotamia and ancient Israel, but I loved those stories so much, the sparseness of them, especially. Meaning so much said with a few words, but somehow the words chosen always seem to invite you, the reader, to elaborate more. And I loved that, and I wanted to get closer, I guess. And my way of getting closer was to study the languages themselves, and to really come to know what each word was bringing with it to a sentence, what history of development or what other languages had it traveled to get there. Or, a lot of words are mysteries. So we have only our own conjecture over how they entered a language, whether they were borrowed or do they evidence a shared root between the two languages. A mystery. So I think that it was a kind of reading to study language and ultimately I think what drove me to write there. I mean, there's a lot of things that compelled me to write fiction, or made it so I couldn't put it off anymore. Of course, I'd wanted to so badly my whole life, but I also wanted to fly, but I do think that starting to write at first was a kind of reading, like a kind of way to be reading and to be listening for like a music inside words and inside sentences, and internalizing that music. And then in some ways, I think in real early things I wrote, essentially imitate it, try to find that rhythm that I that had lodged itself in me. So, and I think I try not to scrutinize my own word choice too much when I'm generating material. I don't know about you. I'd be interested to hear, like, when you, at what stage you permit yourself to begin sort of like re-encountering and editing sentences. I try to put that off for quite a while. So sometimes I'll end up, thinking really carefully and replacing a word with one that feels right. But actually, more often than not, I'm surprised by, I'll learn later that there was something almost miraculous about a word choice. And that's always exciting, because sometimes I feel like what I'm writing, if you get inside it enough, it starts to develop its own intelligence, kind of. And then writing is a kind of listening. You're listening to what you wrote, and it all, I mean, I'm wary of sounding too sort of mystical or anything when I talk about writing. And yet sometimes it really does feel that way. Like if I get out of my own way, the things will conjure themselves. So yes, but yes. Yeah.
Well, I love how you put that, and the music and the intelligence at the level of the sentence creates this sort of irresistible current for the reader, and it's such a marvel to me that on the one hand, your novel is propelled by plot. You know, that there's ways in which it has the kind of tautness and it has the kind of high stakes of a political thriller, you know, in sort of like the Graham Greene tradition. Yet at the same time, for a reader like me who doesn't usually read for plot, but reads for sentences, it also creates this urgency and this momentum because of, I think, that musicality and because of that vitality at the level of the sentence. So it's like these sort of two different sources of energy are just like carrying us on a current through the book. But then another quality about the passage that you read with Emily that I wanted to touch on, and in part because I feel like it hasn't entered yet the conversation about this book, because there are such tragic events that the book sort of orbits around, but and yet there's humor in so many of these smaller moments, and I just, as you were reading, I just chuckled to myself, the acupressure therapist from Florida, and the detail about the little dog pooping in a space that is also where they eat. So can you talk a little bit about how you created room for those moments of levity, or for those moments where there is this gentle humor, and why that was important to you?
Yes, I think you and I have talked a little about, maybe at one of your readings, like decisions about when to be gentle with your characters, and when to, what protecting them means, and when one can't protect them. So in this book, everyone in their own particular way is operating in a world where there is all kinds of violence, ideological, personal, abstracted, and very literal. All so from these things, I didn't. It would be, I guess, insincere or even fraudulent to somehow make all these characters floating through this world and not affected by that violence. And yet also there were so many ways in which I wanted to love them, you know, and let them experience full, rich lives. And I think I think like stories like the one, or chapters, although it feels a little like a story to me, that interlude, like the one I read, I think they provide a very different function. So there's these sort of longer, more maybe intense, I suppose one might say, plot-driven chapters that constitute maybe the I don't want to say meat of the book, but something very substantial in it. And then these shorter interludes, kind of interstitial chapters that were a little initially modeled after, or taking a cue from the interstitial chapters in Our Time, the Ernest Hemingway, which Michel Attioli suggested to me, and I have to admit, I'd always considered it kind of a point of pride that I'd never read Hemingway. It felt like a big accomplishment. And I was like, ooh, do I want to give this up? But then I'm glad I did, because it really opened something up for me to have these short interstitial chapters that are, have an emotional, maybe a softer contemplative emotional thing, and a lot of them very much in the realm of memory. So I guess what I'm saying is, I didn't want to let the priorities of the book depicting a reality and fulfilling the expectations of certain plot events that were put in motion. I didn't want those expectations to completely dominate the lives of the characters. They have their own lives and their own thoughts and things that are important to them. And Emily, thinks a lot about the dynamics of her marriage and her choices in terms of her decision to stay in Israel and to make a life there. And, every single character has a deep, private, interior life. And I think I wanted to make space for that, not just to give myself a break and the reader a break, but also in the interest of resisting any possibility that these characters could be read as, symbols in their political dilemma. So I think a few different functions were served by that decision for these softer moments, be they of tenderness or memory or love or humor or silliness or all these important feelings, as important, I think, as passion and rage.
No, and they provide just this sort of beautiful counterpoint throughout the novel. I mean, there's just so many different notes, to go back to the metaphor of music and musicality. There's so many different notes that are being played throughout this novel, often simultaneously and in counterpoint to each other. So Emily, the character who you introduced us to is, I love this term, momfluencer. Am I getting the term right?
That's how I would say it.
A momfluencer. Someone who actually, has carved out a job for herself by documenting her life as a new mother on social media platforms like Instagram, and sort of creating a very aestheticized representation of her life in Jerusalem and her life, her domestic life as a new mother. But Emily isn't the only character for whom technology and social media are very present in their lives. Often we meet characters through that medium. I'm thinking about how we meet Ori for the first time, as he is sort of framing. He's one of the young soldiers who is going through his mandatory army time, and he's very carefully framing a photo of his Taver, his gun, and his boots, and he's debating what caption to put, and he's sort of anticipating the response he's going to get. And of course, this kind of detail is a way of establishing setting, and a way of establishing that this is very much a contemporary novel and a novel of this moment. But I feel as if the role of social media in the book is more than simply kind of historical detail. Like I feel as if it's doing something more important than simply kind of establishing when the novel is taking place. And I was just curious how you were thinking about it, and how it was shaping these characters' lives, and how it was shaping your approach to narrating these characters' lives.
Yes, I think I really needed to justify how much time I spend on Instagram. No, I'm just kidding.
It's research. It's research.
It's research. It's all research. No, but yes, it was really important to me, and I knew that as I was writing it. And I think it began as really just trying to be faithful to what to the daily fabric of people's lives as I understood them and witnessed them and participated them all over, but yes, very, very much in Israel and Palestine, where the way the conflict is imaged is really critical to how it's narrated, and you'll witness a lot of online conflicts happening on sort of angry online discussions, we'll call them, over what an image means, what is outside the frame, what is inside the frame, how is it framed, and this will come up a lot. So I suppose I knew that I wanted to be faithful to the reality that that online life is very important to news that emerges within Israel and about Israel, and is often ignored. Maybe there's a kind of I've noticed maybe a bit of like a tendency to really want to cast the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in kind of these like as this sort of like ancient, sort of like ancient ancient strife between two foes. It's like it's sprung from Abraham, and they haven't gotten along since. Like just this kind of, and whereas in fact that's not the case, and there's a lot of modern pressures and modern dynamics, including, a lot of money and the legacies of colonialism, which doesn't seem directly related to social media, but somehow is, like, in that we all live in this era. But I think, so that was a decision that I knew I wanted to include. I knew that I wasn't going to somehow like conveniently erase the internet and social media and from the chapters. But I think that as I was in them and writing, it's almost as if, without realizing it, I began telling kind of another story. As images were beginning to take on their own lives, as it were, and there was a constant preoccupation with how people are depicting themselves and like reading each other. And I kind of began to understand at a certain point that I was setting some kind of expectation, but I didn't actually know what the expectation was yet. But people who would read the novel in the workshop, for example, would say, like, I'm really excited to see like where all this emphasis on images and social media culminates. And I was like, yeah, like, wow, me too. Oh dear, but I realized that I was putting something in motion that I myself had essentially like made it part of the contract, as it were, between the reader and the writer. I'm going to do something with this. There's going to be consequences to this. And ultimately there are, but that wasn't really part of a plan or anything. It's almost that I then had to sort of make good on the focus. If I kept focusing on the images people made of themselves, meaning the photos they posted online, or the ways they commented on other people's photos, or the way they framed images or retook images, or the disparity between what they were trying to communicate about themselves and maybe how they actually felt about their lives, that all of this focus was accumulating into a set of expectations that I had to fulfill, which honestly for a while was kind of scary. Like, I was like, what is this just going to fizzle out? Like, am I going to be able to give this its own crisis? I think it worked out well, but yes. So I that was an interesting sort of like lesson in, I guess, another kind of listening. Like, I didn't have a plan or an expectation that social media would become a critical part of the novel, and maybe something that's being engaged with critically. It was initially just a kind of fealty to the fabric of daily life. But as I was listening to what I was writing and listening to friends respond to what I was writing, I came to understand that there was something else that wanted to emerge, something more drastic and consequential and frightening.
And that's such a powerful example of how in the process of writing, especially when we're writing deeply and closely and listening as you describe, how sometimes we're leaving clues for ourselves, or sort of leaving a breadcrumb trail for ourselves that we're not even conscious of as we're doing it. But to sort of see it culminate in the way that it does in your novel is so powerful. And it actually is a chance for me to talk about another character briefly, which Vera, because Vera, the freelance German journalist, she plays a pivotal role in this sort of culminating crisis that you're describing. And her character and sort of her project of representing the conflict as a journalist and the ethical issues that raises is one of the really powerful threads in the novel. But it was also a question that her character and her presence in the novel raised for me the question of how is writing about Jerusalem in nonfiction, how is that? I mean, this sounds like an embarrassingly basic question, but given that you have both written about Jerusalem in nonfictional form and you have now written about it in fictional form, what can you say in fiction that you can't say in nonfiction, and vice versa? Now, since you have experience with both.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Well, I mean, I will say Vera, yeah, her chapters were some of the most sort of propulsive to write. Like, they would come out really quickly and then they would just flatten me. They would exhaust me because she's so, she's so angry at everyone, no one more than herself, and so there's, I sort of miss writing her, but I'm glad I probably won't have to again. But yeah, so like a lot of journalists, and myself included, maybe it's a little bit of a stretch to call myself a journalist, but this is my reading, so but like a lot of journalists, I think I struggled, or just people writing nonfiction, I struggled to know how much and when to put myself at the center. And also the ways in which often you're putting yourself at the center, even if you yourself are not a character in the nonfiction story you're telling. Your point of view and the way that you describe other people, and in Vera's case, she's a white woman just describing brown people, and is often, without realizing it, revealing her own biases. And it felt important to me to have Samar, the Palestinian professor who writes essentially critical theory about the occupation, to give her the sort of an ability to kind of resist Vera, who writes about her, and this benefits Samar, but Samar also feels not entirely comfortable with Vera's work. And it felt that that's something that you can, if there's a way to do that in nonfiction, I don't know it, which is to tell a story and then sort of undermine it. There probably is a way to do that in nonfiction. But I have only been able to do that in fiction, to tell it and then untell it. And to let those two narratives stand together. One doesn't cancel the other out. I tried to make this a sort of feature of the novel. There's conflicting narratives and they don't cancel each other out, but let them become a kind of discordant truth chorus kind of thing. And so I think that's something I needed to do in fiction. Nonfiction has the benefit you can explicitly explain things to a reader and they expect you to, so in her nonfiction, the character, in her dispatch for Der Spiegel, like Vera could the character Vera could say, you know, I'm now crossing the 1967 armistice line, and in this way I'm, you know, entering into territory the UN says. How fraudulent for a character to be narrating that in fiction, though. I mean, that would totally, completely pull a reader out of the internal experience, and all they would really hear, that it would be as if, you know, the writer's head popped up like a talking head in a history documentary and started informing them. So in fiction, I had to find tacit ways to inform a reader on the geography, on the languages that were being spoken, on maybe what one character is hearing when another speaks, if that what they're hearing is colored by their education and experiences and their own languages and their own ability to detect someone's accent, and in that way pinpoint that person geographically. You know, are they Palestinian from a village and using a slightly different vocalization than someone from like one of the cities would? Or are they Israeli, Jewish Israeli, but Mizrahi, coming from the Arab world, and so their pronunciation of Hebrew is more inflected by Arabic, which is to say they pronounce letters in a more almost historical way, as opposed to in modern Hebrew as it's taught by the state, which tends to assimilate letter sounds a little more so that they are essentially easier for Ashkenazi Jews like me to pronounce. I mean, you know what? I shouldn't simplify it that much. There's more complicated tactical reasons in the choices that were made when the state of Israel sort of decided on an official Hebrew. So I don't know enough about that, but I'd like to know about it. But anyway, so all of these things I would have to find ways to sort of like tactically, discreetly inform a reader about, but not make the reader aware that I was trying to feed them information subtly. And that's where really good readers would come in too, to say like, hey, here, I could really hear you giving me information. It sounded a little off. But with nonfiction, you don't need to worry about that. In fact, your job is to explicitly inform. So those are like those are some of the sort of the calculations I made. Yeah.
Well, the tapestry of detail by which you inform us as the reader, I mean, is delicious. Like the recurrence of that Mizrahi pop song that we hear throughout the book. And there's like a wonderful passage where you give an example of how an older generation who grew up speaking Yiddish and only knew Hebrew in its sort of most literary form. There's a hilarious example of this very archaic way in which an older generation would talk about, lo, the taxi driver just ripped me out. I mean, it was just like, so one of the real pleasures of the book is coming away from it and realizing that I do, as you talk about these nuances and these complexities of language and history that inform Jerusalem, that I'm like, oh yeah, I know that, but it's a knowledge that's been acquired in this sort of purely almost sensory way for me, that it was something that I was acquiring without my even realizing it.
I love the example of the more archaic Hebrew, in part because that is something a little actually based on, well, a few things, on anecdotes that I heard, but actually on my own experience a little, because I went to Israel and I was doing a Jewish studies master's, and I was doing a lot of biblical Hebrew, and I was learning modern Hebrew at the same time. But often my knowledge of biblical Hebrew, when I was first learning, would outpace my knowledge of modern Hebrew. And so I would just take a guess and try something in a kind of biblical Hebrew and see if it worked in modern Hebrew. And the response, it was, it made people like hilarious. Like that, I was at a friend's house for dinner, And I was really just learning. So I was using very basic sentences, a Jewish Israeli friend. I was using very basic sentences like, I want this. I don't want that. Thank you. This is tasty, like very, very simple. And at the end of the meal, his mother was trying to get me to take like a fifth helping, of course, so, and I was like, no, like, no, like I ate enough. And then I said, "Achalti lesov'a," because I had heard a phrase I was doing a translation of, I was in a translation course and we were working on some of the prophets, and I'd heard a similar phrase. And I said it would be the equivalent of saying like, like, unto satiation have I eaten, basically, I said. Like, it was the most like literary, flowery, archaic, like maybe these words had not even been said aloud ever, in like 3,000 years or something. And the whole table just kind of looked at me like, what is this person who speaks with grade school level Hebrew? Suddenly it's like little prophet Isaiah is sitting at our table. What is going on? So that one was a little born out of out of experience.
Well, Rebecca, Miles is giving me the signal that I can ask one more question. So before I hand the floor over to the audience, I have to ask this question because it was one of the qualities in your writing, and it was actually a chapter about Emily, the character you introduced us to tonight. And you wrote a chapter about Emily and her husband Ido, and how they're navigating their sex life post-birth. And the challenges, like the physical challenges, the emotional challenges of reconnecting sexually after this life-changing event has happened. And you, can I read this little quote that I came across today that really made me think about how radical I felt your approach to writing about sex is. So this was a little quote from Samuel Delaney's memoir called The Motion of Light in Water. And he, in this book, sort of imagines the future sexual revolution that he hopes will take place. And he says that revelation will come precisely because of the infiltration of clear and articulate language into the marginal areas of human sexual exploration. Now that a significant range of people have begun to get a clearer idea of what has been possible among the varieties of human pleasure in the recent past, heterosexuals and homosexuals, females and males will insist on exploring them even further. And I think that was exactly what you brought, this infiltration of clear and articulate language into a chapter about a couple's like first foray into anal sex. And so before I hand the floor over, will you talk to me a little bit? Because I'm someone who comes from a generation that still feels like, okay, maybe I shouldn't speak for my entire generation. I'll just speak for myself. It still feels like shy about writing directly about sex. Like I feel as if I still have to use metaphor, or I still have to come at it obliquely. And there was just this honesty and frankness and courage and just like unfussiness in how you wrote about it that just knocked my socks off, and continued to as I read the book as a whole, because that's not the only great sex scene. There's many. so will you talk to us a little bit about how you think about that?
With pleasure. I think I tried not to I've noticed sometimes when I'm reading sex in a novel, even if the novel's been written with like a really close sort of interiority, like really close to a character, when a sex scene comes, it feels a little more like the characters are performing for a reader, or the language is has a role in sort of being an intermediary between the reader and the actual actors in the scene. But I think I really tried to think of like the language and the sensations that were as if none of us were watching, I guess, as if the couple involved were really did have like the privacy to explore, sometimes successfully, sometimes less so. And I think too, I've come to sort of feel that sex has no real inherent meaning one way or the other. It's our feelings and our own sort of narrations and desires and memories that bring meaning to it, that the same as any other act. So I think not giving sex any sort of fixed or inherent value, but needing the meaning to be created like between the people who are engaged in it, or even if their experiences are very different. I think that might account a little for maybe for how it reads. But it makes me, I mean, it makes me happy, frankly, to hear, that because what is more embarrassing than writing a bad sex scene? Like, oh, you could just die. You could just crawl under your desk and never come out. And everyone's done it, of course. So, but I think I felt the times where maybe I was falling short of something, where I started to think about it being read. I started to imagine someone reading it and maybe became myself excited by the idea of shocking someone or surprising someone. And then I would kind of lose it. I would lose whatever made it actual intimacy. And I always had to go back to how are the people inside these moments experiencing them and telling themselves and each other about them. And that's always what I tried to return to.
Rebecca, I feel like every choice that you made in this book was always guided by that compass of what would this character on the inside, like just using that compass of every character's specific interiority. And it just, as a result, creates a book that has just such enormous power. There's just such fidelity to honoring each character's unique consciousness and unique depth. So I will now invite your avid readers to jump in with their questions. And Miles, do you share those questions with us?
Yes, I will be the moderator here and pose them to you both. So we've got a number of excellent questions. First one, Erica's got a great question. You've spoken, Rebecca, previously about taking the time to slow down in your writing, that even when you know where a chapter or a moment is going, taking time to slow down is an imperative part of the writing. What was the hardest moment in the writing process where you had to force yourself to slow down?
Ooh. Where I had to, what a great question. Thank you, Erica. Where I had to force myself to slow down. I think as the plot began to really have its own momentum, and I got very excited by that, by all of the events that were going to happen, and everyone was going to have to respond to them. And it started to feel like, oh my gosh, I might be writing a book. Like maybe this isn't just a series of vignettes of like people in cars remembering their mothers. Like maybe this is actually a book. And I got excited by that, I think. And I think those a lot of like those moments really related to like plot and to, as I said, giving characters something to react to. And maybe also when one character would walk through another character's story and I would know, oh, they're going to touch here, the narratives are going to touch here. And then the best feeling ever, which is like, oh good, I have work to do tomorrow. Like, because this is always the hope. Like, I know, not only do I know what I'm writing now, I know what I'll have to write tomorrow. So, life goes on, good. So I think moments like that where I could feel the book and its momentum and the characters moving in each other's stories, and I would get very excited, and it would be hard not to rush. And as I've documented, unfortunately for everyone to see, I have a very complicated, borderline occult writing practice that tends to some of those issues.
All right. So we've got a question here from Vu.
Hi, Vu, is that Vu Tran?
We think so, yes. We don't have a last name, but we suspect.
A wonderful teacher and writer who I worked with in Chicago. Hi, Vu, I'm so excited you're here.
So Vu wants to know, what's the most significant way that writing this novel has changed your perspective on Israel or that area of the world, or simply your relationship to your own experience there?
Yes. Writing this novel, I had to face a lot of my own assumptions, my own blind spots, you might say. At first, I thought I would only have to do that for the characters. I thought I would only have to force characters to face their own blind spots, meaning what do they not let themselves know about themselves? What's a fact about them or a reality about them that contradicts the neat story they tell about themselves? Little did I know, in fact, I would, in this process, would end up doing the same for myself, meaning I would be forced to face maybe realities or let's say contradictions between how I thought of myself and how I was actually acting in the world. How committed was I really to questioning a status quo? How comfortable was I when I was in the a favorable position in an ethnic democracy? And I think that these were not easy questions to face. And I think more than anything, writing this book forced me to think about the ways in which I have been complicit in state violence. And it's hard to know what to do with that. I think we all hope that, some kind of despair or painful self-knowledge won't just end with self-flagellation, but will, result in some kind of action. But I think for me, I have sort of remained, or I have been a little unsettled by writing this novel, but I think being unsettled is a good thing for a writer to be, so.
All right, so William, hello, William. William is interested in the full cast of characters here, but particularly on how you manage writing in different distinct voices from character to character. So how did you find your way into each voice of different characters across different geographic and ethnic identities?
I tended to only write one point of view at a time. It wasn't like I was writing several at a time, so I would really let myself just like submerge into that voice. I do think my study of languages helped a lot, that I have studied Hebrew, both the biblical and the modern, and Arabic, the literary modern standard, and the Palestinian colloquial. So it's not like I could only hear characters in English. It's not like I could only, there wasn't certainly ultimately there were many, many acts of translation in writing this novel, translating the conflict into terms that might be a little more recognizable to Americans. So maybe tapping on whiteness, maybe a little as a kind of familiar touchstone in a way, or translating things that were uttered in Arabic or in Hebrew into English, so that I could write them, essentially. But in my imagination, I tried to limit how much translation was happening. So I tried to imagine as much as I could in the language the character was speaking, which I think helped make the narration of each character maybe feel a little distinct, because I was thinking of maybe features of the languages that they language themselves in, let's say. But it is tricky. I think also maybe trying to whenever maybe there's certain crutches I as a writer have, and that's a way that I think you can start to feel a lack of distinction between different voices if you can recognize like the writer's sort of tics or tendencies in each one. Like, oh, this person has a real addiction to semicolons and they're everywhere and you can really tell. Or, this person has a habit of doing like, a really long sentence and then a fragment, and then a really long sentence and a fragment. Or so I think just maybe staying aware of, by the way, 100% describing myself. I think staying aware of some of the sentence tactics that you yourself as a writer rely on, and trying to see what happens when you don't use them anymore, or at least limit how much you use them, because that's something that kind of makes the presence of the writer come through each point of view, each voice, in a way that maybe you want to avoid or limit.
All right. So we have a question here that I think talks about the kind of the politics of the novel, and is interested in knowing how this fits into the broader conversation about Palestinian statehood and ending the occupation. Do you have kind of political goals for the writing, or are your concerns more literary and artistic?
I think that if I have a role to play in the discourse, let's say, it would be that I want to make it harder for anyone to talk about anyone in the conflict as a symbol. I want to make that harder, because it's pretty rampant. And I know there's a lot of talk of, in theoretical discussions, almost everything is determined to be violence, this sort of like great, persistent, abstracted violence. And yet I really do feel that if you are rendering an individual into a symbol, unequivocally that's a horrendous violence that has material consequences for that person. So I don't want to beg the question. I'm invested in Palestinian self-determination, but that's not something I could pretend this book, I think, would really. I want to be realistic with myself about what the reach of this book is, and what it can do. And I think my hope is what it can do is remind anyone who reads it that each human being is exactly that, a human being, and not a symbol. And it would make me very happy to find out that someone who had very fixed political ideas, one way or the other, read the book and found them identifying with a character they didn't want to identify with, that would that would make me, not just because I had achieved something as a writer, although I can't pretend that wouldn't be part of it, but also because this kind of mutual recognition of the divinity that we all share, you know, that we really are all sacred. I would hope that comes through.
All right, time for one more, last one. Josh wants to know, which character did you always want to come back to? Whose voice were you cloying to get back to in the writing?
You know, I found myself returning to Samar sometimes when I needed some kind of, if not direction, but perspective. I highly recommend writing from the point of view of a character who's better read than you are. I think it's a wonderful tactic. It'll really push you to learn, to read more, to learn your subject matter with more intensity and integrity. And that definitely is the case with Samar. You know, she's an academic who writes about memory and narrative and occupation, and has all of these tools to understand what is happening to her, and then the painful reality that so often in moments where she's confronted with state violence, it doesn't really matter how she'll narrate it after. What matters, of course, is that she survives it. But for me, in writing her chapters, I think I was really afforded a kind of a more at once nuanced and yet broader understanding of what are the larger mechanisms at play, what are the patterns, what does power look like, what does power look for, and how does power always somehow manage to erase its own traces in your life, on everything from the level of language to architecture. And I think she made me a more critical reader of the world that I was trying to depict. And it was definitely, writing from her point of view was definitely rising to an occasion, and maybe almost thinking beyond myself. I really had to push myself, but it always in the end felt like the book's direction and focus was righted. After spending time with Samar.
Oh, thank you so much, Rebecca. This has been fantastic. So, Sarah, any closing remarks?
You're muted.
Still muted, Sarah.
I'm sorry. I was just really taking in your beautiful answers, Rebecca, to those wide-ranging questions. And I just want to say thank you for writing this book. Thank you to Chevaliers for giving me a chance to talk to you about it. And to thank the audience for joining us in this conversation that I hope is a conversation that will continue. You know, both around the book, but also around the conflict, and also around the questions of humanity and the sacredness of that humanity that Rebecca, you articulated so well. So thanks to everyone for coming. And Miles, is there a way to, like a link to buy the book?
Yes, there is. Thank you so much for asking, Sarah. The link is down in the chat. You can buy signed copies. We can even get Rebecca to personalize a copy for you. And if you're in town, you can always stop by our store and pick one up yourself. So link is here. They're also available at chevaliersbooks.com.
Sarah, thank you so much. I adore you and I admire you. And I've been looking forward to this for weeks. So thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and have a wonderful night. Bye, you all.